This is a new topic we haven't covered in one of our previous episodes, so I'm kind of excited about this one. The topic for today is, so you've launched a successful software product, now what? So this is really aimed at those of you who have gotten through the process of building your version 1 and you've launched it, and now you need to start thinking about what's next. And it's a different set of challenges, different set of objectives once you get your first version released. So we're going to focus on that. A lot of this might be aimed a little bit more at you folks that are with a software startup, but I think this content really applies just as well to launching new products within a larger enterprise. So, as always, I'd like to encourage all of you to please, don't hesitate to ask questions or raise your hand in the chat, and we can cover questions along the way. So if any of you have some more complex questions, we can even bring you up as a panelist as well and kind of go through some of those. So as we dive in, just for those of you that don't know me, my name's Jeff Francis. I'm one of the co-founders of Innovate. We're a digital innovation studio based here in Dallas, Texas. We're an Inc. 5000 company. And, just a little bit about me personally, I've probably been involved with launching more than 200 software products, probably closer to 300 at this point. So have seen a lot over the years, and I really enjoy sharing a lot of those stories with you guys in these webinars. So with that, let's jump right in. So I've basically broken this down into 8 different points or 8 different things that you need to think about. One of the first ones I wanted to cover is there's a pretty common misconception that getting to the launch is the big objective, right? And sort of this thought that if we build it, then the work's done. And what I want to stress to you is that that's not the end of the journey. It's really just the beginning, right? And so, we kind of use the analogy of a rocket ship through some of this, but much like an actual rocket ship, it may take many months or even sometimes years to build and get to that launch moment. And so it's really important for you to be thinking about, what's going to happen next, right? So when you're launching, you need to think about, like, are you actually ready for that phase of the process, right? And have a little bit of clarity about what are you going to need to be prepared for immediately. So is it going to be really just maintenance and sort of monitoring? That would be the case if you're really focused most on validation. Maybe when you've launched an MVP, or like we like to call it an MLP, but you do that initial launch. Are you going to be really just helping to make sure things are stable, monitoring, looking for your validation, or are you going to continue into sort of full-blown product development mode, right? And so the way you prepare for that post-launch is going to be very different depending on what you are intending to do right after your launch of your initial version, right? The other thing here is that when you build a software product and you launch that product, you're now a software company, right? And so there's an expectation, even really a duty to your users to continue to add value to that product, to continue to improve that product, and continue to find ways to improve, right? And so it may sound silly, but any successful software company that comes to mind, if you think of any of the really big names, they didn't launch the product and catch tons of traction and then go in and fire their development team, right? The reason for that is because you're not done. Like, you're really just getting started. So the launch isn't the end, it's just the beginning, right? Next is you need to think about building out your product team. And that may not necessarily mean, hiring a whole full in-house team, but you need to be thinking about, what is my product team? How does that come together? What different roles do I need? What are the responsibilities of everybody? And how am I going to pull that together? And there's a lot of different ways to do that. It's very common that you've built your first product exclusively with some sort of a vendor or a partner that did the development work for you, and they really had most of the responsibility for doing everything. Sometimes, you have an in-house team. So, as you're thinking about that, One of the biggest mistakes that I tend to see, especially in startups, is once they launch and they're thinking about building more of an in-house team, they pretty quickly go towards either I need to hire a CTO or I need to hire an architect or a really senior developer. And that may be the right move, but I want to talk about that for a couple of minutes and give you some other things to think about there. In the situation of a software startup, my personal opinion is that I don't think that usually hiring a CTO is the right move at that stage of the game. We've done a whole series on that. So if you're interested in some more information specifically on that piece of it, reach out to us and we can give you some stuff that's really targeted for that decision. But at a high level, hiring a CTO at this stage isn't really the right fit for what most software companies need. Right then, they're needing to bring some competence and some of that intellectual capital about the product and how the product works and what the product needs to do in-house. So for that reason, I generally tend to recommend hiring a product manager at this stage of the game for a couple of different reasons. One is it kind of sets you up to be what I would kind of label as vendor agnostic, right? Where your true knowledge about your users, the product, what features are there, why the features are there, how to plan the roadmap, how to know whether things are going the direction that the product needs to go. That's valuable information to have in-house. And then you can have flexibility to work with different partners or a variety of partners, or you're in a much more flexible situation, right? And so the other thing that's pretty nice about a product manager as one of your early hires is that they can wear several different hats, which product managers, most people didn't hear about the role of product managers 10 years ago, but it's a really important role in product development these days. And one of the things that's usually present in a really good product manager is they can wear a lot of hats. They're very versatile. So they can talk to the development team, bridge that communication between stakeholders and the development team. They can talk to customers and help understand what are customers wanting, what's the feedback, and then turn around and translate that. The other thing that they can do, especially in sort of a B2B SaaS type of scenario, they can help with pre-sales or they can help with sales efforts. So them being involved with conversations with prospective customers not only brings some real good expertise to those conversations, which can help you win new clients, but it also helps a lot because they can get that direct feedback from the customers on what would be valuable. And they can turn around and account for that in their product roadmap and their plans, right? So couple thoughts there on building out your team. Other things to think about there, like so if I had to sort of think about like a typical path that might be pretty good is pretty early on, tilting more towards hiring the product manager. And then beyond that, maybe going for like a lead developer or a senior developer. You don't need an architect usually at that point because it's not usually a big consistent need for true architecture work that early in the game, but starting to bring some of that development capability in-house is not a bad idea. Beyond that, it's more a function of how many developers do I maybe need more of a scrum master or a project manager or QA. There could be quite a variety in what the path beyond those first couple of hires look like, but just a few thoughts on building out your product team. But the other thing I would say here is that don't be too quick to think that you have to build your entire team in-house, right? By using partners or using contractors or freelancers, you maintain a lot of flexibility, right? And so preserving your capital and being very smart about how you invest your money early on is still really important. So that kind of takes me to the next point, which is being clear about your runway. And what I mean there is being very clear about what kind of budget you have to work with, what's your funding situation, how much capital you have, and how do you need to plan on using that. So getting a really clear picture about what your monthly burn is going to be, overall, but we're talking pretty specifically about product development today, is having a clear plan for like, what's your monthly budget? How does that correlate to your product roadmap and how fast you need to go? And, it's a pretty tough environment for startups to raise funds right now. So, you may want to be a little bit extra conservative in your projections on how long you think you can make it at a certain pace. So be really clear about your monthly expenses and what those are going to look like, what your product roadmap is going to look like, and make sure to sort of overlay those together so that you can get a clear picture about, what kind of a runway you have. This is a huge one, especially for those that are based in the US. So it's very common to build an MVP or build an early version of the software with a very largely or almost entirely offshore team. And so that works really good for a lot of different reasons, cost effectiveness being a really big part of that. But once you launch a live product and you have something in production, you have real users. Again, we're going to kind of talk mostly about like US based companies for this topic. But when you launch that product, one thing that you have to keep in mind is what are the support needs going to be during US time zones. So our India team and other offshore teams that I've worked with in the past, they typically work in, our nighttime, and there's an overlap in the morning, but they tend to wrap up their day, mid to late morning, US time. And so what happens if you have a pretty major issue late in the day? Do you have a plan for that? Do you have somebody that can respond to it? For instance, take a worst case scenario of like a total production outage, right? Like something's completely locked up or shut down. Users can't get into the system at all. Do you have some sort of a plan for that? And this one, a lot of times it doesn't have a really good, easy answer for early stage companies, because you're having to balance what your budget is with this need to support production software. And so some of this is going to be really tailored to your situation, especially how many users you have, how many platforms there are, what other resources you have available on your team. And so I can give you just a couple of thoughts here. In terms of options, what you have is an option where you just try to extend your overlap as late as you can. Try to get that overlap to maybe midday or early afternoon, where you know that you have somebody online that is able to respond to urgent issues. Another option would be that you can find resources that will work a shifted schedule. So for India, take for instance like an offshore team that's supporting the production application. Sometimes you can work out an arrangement where one or some of those resources actually work daytime in the US. Now, it gets a little bit harder to find resources because a lot of folks don't like to do that, right? So first you got to find people who are willing to do that. And then usually there's going to be some sort of a cost premium for that level of support, right? Because they're usually going to have to pay people more to work sort of the night shift, India, for instance, right? So that could be an option, is you still use an offshore resource or resources, but they work sort of a shifted schedule. The other option is you have someone here in, more of the US time zone. That could be, in the US, that could be South America or Mexico or Brazil or something like that. That's a more similar time zone. So if you go like, South America is an option that's going to maybe be a little bit more cost effective than a US resource would be. But it's still going to be a whole lot more than offshore resources. The other option that I've seen people do before is that you can sort of commit to time for someone during that time zone without having to have them full time. So if you can find someone that has the flexibility in their schedule enough to be available in urgent issues, you may need to pay like a set amount sort of for that insurance policy for them to be around. So one way you could arrange that is you find somebody that you can commit, 10 hours or 20 hours a week to. And if they need that time for supporting production issues, then okay, that's how it gets used. But if not, maybe they can also continue to contribute to development work, right? So maybe they take tickets and they continue to work, but you have someone, even if they're not fully allocated, in that US time zone. But you need to make sure that that person is versatile enough to be able to touch various components of the system, right? So you probably are going to want somebody very familiar with backend or the infrastructure. That would be a hot spot for potential production issues. You would not, for example, probably need an iOS mobile app developer to be on standby, right? Because just the nature of how that release process works, you tend not to have these sort of unexpected, really urgent front end related issues. So it's usually going to be more of a back end or an infrastructure type of thing if it's a production issue that comes up unexpectedly. So just some thoughts to think through. Maybe working with an offshore or using an offshore team worked really good during your product development. But when you go live, you may have to have a little different plan for addressing those sort of live production types of things. Another one here is timing is key. So being clear, I talk a lot in lots of these different live workshops on different topics. A common theme is clarity. Like clarity is the antidote to risk, in my opinion. And so the more clear you can be about things, the better you can anticipate, plan, and make better decisions. And so what I'm talking about here on this slide, when I say timing is key, is getting clear on the timing of perhaps like your roadmap, right? So I think a common problem here is that folks will tend to get very focused in on just what's in front of them. Like, hey, we've got these tickets for this sprint that we're working on now, or this sprint that we're going to be working on next. And so when you get very focused on what's just in front of you, sometimes you forget to back up, zoom out, look at the high level picture, right? And that gives you better visibility of sort of how do you need to plan, what needs to come next, and are you on track? So an example of this would be, instead of focusing on specific tickets only, make sure that you have a regular part of your process to sort of back up and look at the product roadmap at a higher level. And I like to do this by thinking, epics or sort of large feature sets or efforts. And, it could be something, you don't need to overcomplicate this. A good tool for getting clear on this could be just a Google sheet or an Excel spreadsheet where you've got a list of those high level priorities, and you've got some sort of status assigned to those, like needs requirements, needs design, ready to go, complete, something real high level for you to see kind of where those are in terms of what's needed next. And then it's really important to make sure that you've got an effort estimate, even an imperfect high level estimate associated to each of those things. That's another really big problem I see, is where you'll have these priorities or these feature sets identified, but there's no sort of quantification of the effort required for that. So you can't really plan. You don't know if this is a feature that's going to take, a 1-2 week sprint, or if it's going to take, 2 months or 3 months, right? So once you have these priorities identified, getting them slotted in the priority order that you want to take them, make sure you're clear about what's the state of them. Like, if we had the resources, could we work on it right now, or we still need requirements, or is there some other dependency? And then the other one is making sure that we are really clear on the estimated effort for that, even if it's sort of at the epic level. So timing is key, being clear on that time frame. The other one, one of the other reasons why this gets really important when you launch live software is that you've got real clients, and whether you're talking to those clients directly in a B2B type of situation, or if it's less direct, like in a B2C type of scenario. If you're taking feature requests from customers, very likely the next question they're going to ask is, when can I have it, right? When's it going to be ready? When are you going to launch it? And so you want to make sure that you build credibility with your users by being able to give pretty accurate timeframes on when you expect to launch certain upgrades or features. Next, I've called this one measure twice, cut once. Everybody's heard this phrase before. But what I'm really talking about here is something we call like MVAs, or minimum viable analytics. Said more simple, what are your KPIs? What are the metrics that you're looking at that help you to understand whether you're hitting your goals or not? And so I talk a lot about the concept of validation gates. And what I mean by that is that at each stage of the product lifecycle, you need to be really clear on what is the next validation gate, right? Meaning, what is it that I need to get to next, and how do I measure it to know whether we continue on with this product development effort, right? And so after you launch your MVP, you need to make sure that if you don't already have the capability to capture these metrics, that needs to be a high priority. You need to get that in there as soon as possible. And you need to be really clear on what those things are and how they tie to the success of the product or the success of the business. So make sure you know what those basic metrics are. Make sure you're reviewing those regularly with your team and the necessary stakeholders. And then also to know what your targets are, right? Another thing that kind of goes into this bucket a little bit is what I would really more consider monitoring. This would be monitoring for performance and potential issues. So you'd be surprised how many people launch a first version of their product and they don't have even basic monitoring to understand like what's going on with the system. This is sort of your early warning signs. So, I'll give you an example. Years ago, we had, a product that was really stable. Everything was going fine. The clients weren't on a maintenance plan or anything. So we hadn't heard from them in a while, but they suddenly had a production outage, right? And what the issue turned out to be, it was related to infrastructure. Some of the resources that I think, if I remember correctly, there was like a storage space that had filled up with their current like tier that they were on. And so when that backed up and it filled up, then the system stopped working, right? And so if you have monitoring in place, you can be alerted to those types of issues early enough that you can be aware of it, take action, make adjustments before a user even knows that there's a problem. So monitoring is super important. So make sure that you've got basic monitoring set up that's going to someone and that they're looking at that, right? Next, I want to talk a little bit about the release process. So, while you're in development, especially up to the point where you're launching your V1, you don't have to think a lot about the standardization or the sophistication of your release process. But once you have a live product and you have real users, this becomes really, really important, right? So you can't just push releases like you do into a dev environment. You have to make sure that you're clear about when you're going to release it, what is getting released, has it been tested, how do we monitor it once it's been pushed? So there's a lot to that process that is more intensive than maybe just pushing updates while you're during development when you don't actually have a live product anymore. So no sort of ad hoc unauthorized pushes. So things you need to think about here are locking down the production environment. So only certain people have the ability to even make a change to that environment. Having a documented process for your release that you do not deviate from. So make sure you have a check, even if it's just a simple checklist. These are the steps that we go through every time we do a push to production, right? Being clear about who's involved in sort of the approval or sign-off process, right? Is there a QA person that's responsible for sort of certifying the release that it's ready to go? Do they sign off on it? Is there a product owner that has to sign off on it? So making sure that you document that and you're clear about like who all's involved, what their role is, and that all of those different steps are completed before you push to production is going to be really important, right? And a little bit about like timing of releases. You need to put some thought to that as well. As a rule of thumb, as an example, generally it's not a great idea to push major updates on like a Friday afternoon, right? Like your team's there on Friday, they push an update, everything seems fine. They leave for the week or for the weekend, and then it could be hard to get your people back online and assemble everybody to respond to issues like over a weekend. So think about when's the time frame where maybe there's the least impact to your users if there is an issue, and then make sure you have the needed support to respond to anything if there is a problem after that release is made live. Last point on this is never skip your release process. Never, not even for a really small change. And I personally learned this the hard way years ago. We had a product where it was live, had lots of users, and the developers noticed a typo in the mobile app. And they thought that they were being proactive and just going to fix it. I'm just going to change the text and then push an update. And little did they know, it sort of cascaded into this big production issue, but where the long story short, the app had a feature where it sort of prompted the user to install the latest version of the app if they were not already on the latest version. And little did the developer know, when they made that text change and pushed the update, the version number ticked from 0.9 to 0.10, right? Which was intended to be 0.10. But anyway, what happened is all the users got caught in a loop where it was constantly asking them to download the app. So they would download the app and then it would get prompted again, right? And it wasn't a planned release, right? So the point here is no unplanned releases, no releases that skip the release process. It always has to go through, even if it seems like it's a super, super simple change. The last one here that I was going to cover is kind of talking a little bit about the topic of automation. So automation is one of those things that conceptually most people like that concept, but the problem when you're really early in developing a product is that focus on adding automated testing can rob budget from adding features. And so usually, especially prior to a version 1, the prioritization goes to getting features into the product, right? Not lessening the feature set and then, installing or adding automation to the product. But once you've launched, once you have validation, once you have users, once you're really starting to see progress and traction, it may be a good time to revisit, where does automation sit in the sort of priority picture? And it's a great long-term investment. It can speed up and reduce the risk of future releases and can make you really efficient in the long term, right? So like I said, it a lot of times doesn't make sense prior to a V1, but once you launch your first version, it might be a different story at that point. So that's worth revisiting. And then sort of in the vein of automation is automation that's not really related to testing, but it's really related more to DevOps and your release process. So the more that you can automate even simple things like code pipelines and some of the basic level testing that can kind of check some of the big things before it goes out, looking at some of that more DevOps related type of testing and automation can be some kind of quick wins that's worth looking at sort of early on after you've released your first version. So that's covered the 8 items that I thought I would share with you guys on this topic today. I'll open it up for questions. And Jordan, I think you had mentioned that maybe we had a couple of them that got submitted through email. So if you wouldn't mind shooting those to me in the chat. Let's see here. And then the rest of you, if you have other questions, feel free to raise your hand or drop them in the question window and I can pick those up next. So this question was, is there a general benchmark or timeline to use for when to hire which type of resource? This question, this is going to vary a lot from situation to situation. I don't know that I have a benchmark that's tied to something like when you hit this much revenue or when you hit this many users, this is who you hire. For me, it's really more a function of what kind of budget do I have to work with? How aggressive is my product development roadmap? For instance, if my roadmap is pretty light and I'm just going to be ticking away at tickets, addressing bugs, that kind of thing, my answer is going to be much different there than if we know we're full steam product development, right? We need to spin up a bigger team. We need to go faster. We want to start taking down more of our backlog. So the big factors to consider here are going to be, what budget are you working with and what does your roadmap look like? So if you have a big roadmap and you have a budget that can support it, then I would look at sort of that approach that I talked about a little earlier in the workshop of maybe look at product manager first, followed by maybe a senior dev or more of a full stack type of dev or two, followed by maybe a QA person or potentially a project manager. But that also doesn't think about other needs that come up that maybe you don't have a consistent need for, like design or even architecture or DevOps, right? So those are good roles that that augmenting works really well for, because you may not have the consistent need for those niche skill sets to keep somebody really busy 40 hours a week. So in terms of benchmarks and timeline, I think it's a function of budget. It's a function of the roadmap. And then, on top of that, I would add, business objectives that you need to achieve, right? So if you're really knocking it out of the park on some of your real core metrics, like user growth or revenue generated or subscriptions or whatever your really core metric is to your business success, if you're crushing that, then you may be a little bit more aggressive about, starting to assemble more of those capabilities in-house. Right? I hope that helped some. Anybody else have a question? I'll give it just a minute there while we're waiting on to see if there's any other questions. I'm just going to mention that we'd love your feedback on the workshop topic. If you like the topic, you didn't like the topic, any of that feedback's welcome. If you have thoughts or suggestions on future topics that you would like to hear us pick up and talk about, would love to hear about that as well. If you are not on our email list, definitely get on that. We don't send a ton of email, but I think the stuff that we send out is pretty valuable. We've got a newsletter that goes out like once a month. And then we got a weekly email where we sort of pick like a mini topic, kind of like what we did today, and give some of our insights on certain things that come up a lot with our clients that we work with and prospects that we talk to regularly. So if you'd like to get added to that list, drop us an email to info@no8.com. Also, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so connect with me if you're on there, and send me a message if you'd like. I get you added to the list that way as well. I think if we don't have any other questions, we'll go ahead and wrap up for the day. I think I about hit directly on time. I try to keep this to 30 minutes. So hope you got some value out of it. If there's anything that we can do to help you or assist you, or if we can answer any questions, please reach out. We'd love to help. And be on the lookout for an email about like our future episodes. We should have another one coming up in a couple of weeks. So talk to you soon. Thanks, and have a great rest of your week.